Welcome to the Narrate podcast, where we aim to tell God's story with our lives. We'll be continuing to post the Sunday message each week, but we want to dive a little deeper and offer some content to supplement your life with God, and that's where our Beyond Sunday series comes in. Join Adam and Narrate staff as they provide thoughtful discussions, ideas, and interviews that go beyond the message you'll hear on Sunday.
I think this section moves beyond my original goal of speaking to why I'm opting for an Anglican identity and moves into some of the hesitations I've had to work through. Specifically, I want to speak to high and low churchmanship. I love how C4SO is comprised of a wide variety of churches, some very high, others pretty mid, and others quite low. Now, by now you may be asking one of the most common questions I hear, and that is this: what do you mean by high church and low church? Or what do you mean by high or low up the candle? So let's define some terms. What high or low church, or high or low on the candle, or high or low churchmanship speaks to is the degree to which the Sunday service does or does not involve the use of special vestments, that is clothing, especially for the clergy, as well as the use of religious items like candles and incense and other specialized religious furniture and liturgical items. If you've ever been to a Roman Catholic Mass, what you experienced was some variation of high church. And if you've ever been to Narrate, what you've experienced is some variation of low church. I think it's important to see that both have their place, both have upside and both have potential downside. At its best, high church leaves you with a sense of being in sacred space, even the presence of God. High church attempts to engage your whole body, not just your brain. It desires to awaken your whole person to the glory of God, the presence of God, and it uses art and other things to just remind you that God is other and God is holy. But at its worst, high church can feel stuffy, rigid, out of touch, and can leave newcomers feeling pretty left out. At its best, low church speaks of God's incarnational nature, of his desire to draw near us, to reach us, and to enter into our world. Low church wants to make God accessible, approachable, and available to all people. It's especially thoughtful of guests and people new to Christian faith or to church. But at its worst, it leaves no distinction between Sunday worship and going to a concert. At its worst, it trivializes God. Some Anglican churches are high up the candle. Others are very low. I've known that for a long time, but for reasons I've had to work out, I needed to better understand why, where it comes from, what drives those decisions, and ultimately, if there's good historical backing. Now, if the point of my doing this, if part of what animates me is the connection to history, I just needed to see where the permission for both high and low comes from the tradition itself. For my part, for whatever it matters, I think I'd be fine if I was working in the marketplace and going to church. I think I'd be fine going to a high church. I don't think whether or not an Anglican church was high would determine whether or not I attended it. But professionally, and especially in Helena, I have no inclination to lead one and no sense of calling that I'm supposed to. So in my quest to better understand where the permission for high and low comes from, the first thing I did was go back and study the history of the English Reformation. King Henry VIII used his authority to separate from Rome, but he had no desire to dismantle the churchmanship of the English church. He was a high church Catholic and had no desire to become lower or for the church itself to become lower. After King Henry VIII died in 1547, King Edward VI assumed the throne. King Edward was very persuaded by Protestant perspectives, and in his short 6 years brought about a very low church expression. Under King Edward, clergy were actually disallowed from dressing in formal vestments. English churches were stripped of so many of their vestments and liturgical items, oftentimes just sold off in the countryside. Edward's liturgical reforms were largely led by Thomas Cranmer. As a scholar and historian, he had studied the life of the early Christians and was eager to lead the standards of worship back to that of what he called the primitive church, or is more commonly referred to as the Church of the Apostles, or the Apostolic Church, or the Church Fathers, which is to say that back to the style of worship common to those first couple hundred years. He sought, and I'm going to simplify this by putting it in 5 things, he sought 5 changes. 1, greater simplicity. 2, more congregational-wide worship. 3, for the liturgy to be conducted in the language of the people. 4, the restoration of the Eucharist to all Christians, not just to the clergy. And 5, he wanted to hear more scripture and more teaching from the scriptures. Cranmer's reforms ultimately were realized in the Book of Common Prayer, commonly referred to as the BCP, which became mandatory under King Edward, and to fail to do so became a crime. But the death of King Edward VI, it proved a great blow to the reformers. Queen Mary, sometimes referred to as Bloody Mary, followed King Edward, and she wanted to restore the English church to communion with Rome. She was very high church Roman Catholic, and therefore the English church started to return to the high church values. After Queen Mary's death, Queen Elizabeth I came to power. Queen Elizabeth, you might have guessed the pattern is clear by now, was a Protestant. But her persuasion was to a much higher version of church. And so therefore, by the time of Queen Mary's leadership, there became what historians will say really 3 distinct styles or desires for styles of church in England. There was first a contingent of Roman Catholics who obviously favored high church. There was also a group that preferred a Reformed Catholic church, a church that came to be known as an Anglo-Catholic church, and they also tended to prefer a very high version of church. And then there was this third group, commonly referred to as the Puritans, which became all kinds of other kind of Protestant groups. And they were very low. In fact, they weren't just low out of missional values. They had some really strong opinions about vestments. Under Puritan leadership, churches were very plain, and that was by design. See, what I found helpful is understanding that some preferred their persuasion because that's what humans do. Bishop Todd pointed that out to me recently in a conversation I'll return to in a little bit. He said all of them were trying to reproduce themselves because left to yourself, that's what any human will do. But others adopted their perspective out of missional intent. Leaders like John Wesley found the Anglican Church out of touch and failing to reach the everyday person. He took it upon himself to go to the people rather than wait for them to show up at the church on Sunday. Conversely, in the 19th century, a group which came to be known as the Oxford Movement adopted high churchmanship because they observed the lack of beauty, especially among the working class in industrial England. Parishes were drab. The countryside was largely stripped of its natural beauty. Life was hard, dark, and ugly. The Oxford leaders saw missional value in a higher version of church, as it brought beauty back into the lives of people and further invited them to physically experience God's presence by worshiping in re-beautified sacred space. In the words of Dr. Les Fairfield, light, color, and symbolism beautified the worship of the new Anglo-Catholic movement. Stained glass windows were repaired, vestments were put back in place, but it wasn't because of personal preference. It was because they saw this as a great way to reach people and invite them into God's kingdom. They thought that the newfound beauty of art and liturgical beauty would actually have evangelistic value. And it did. So why does that matter? See, I love how Anglicanism invites me to become part of something connected to history and yet alive. I love Anglicanism for its missiology as well as its intellectual modesty. I love its desire to promote God's holy Catholic Church. But I've struggled to reconcile high and low churchmanship. I appreciate the diversity, but what gives it its permission? I recently took this question up with Bishop Todd. He was very gracious and gave me a chance to talk with him on a video chat. And he had some really helpful things to say. As I pushed and asked him about my growing inability to understand why some Anglican churches were high and others low, as I acknowledged, I have my preferences, but I don't think that's what it's all about, he offered some really good insight. The first thing Bishop Todd stressed was that in his view, Cranmer saw the BCP as a toolbox for discipleship and evangelism, and thus, he said, I think Cranmer would want us to use the tools as needed in our context. Now, I'm no Anglican expert, but I know enough about it, and I've interacted with enough of them to know that Bishop Todd's ideas wouldn't be universally agreed upon. And yet, I loved his ideas. It makes great sense. And it's consistent with his missiologist heart, because he always starts with what serves the mission, what makes discipleship and evangelism possible, not personal preference. When we got deeper into vestments, he said this, and I quote, "Vestments don't come from canon law, and they especially don't come from the scriptures. They're tools that may or may not be useful in a particular context. Your job is to nourish your particular community. You can never center around your preferences, but must center it around the needs of your particular community." End quote. Bishop Todd repeatedly emphasized his view that ecclesiology comes after missiology. Again, let's define terms. Ecclesiology has to do with the order of a church service, with how we conduct ourselves as a local church. Missiology refers to evangelism and discipleship, to putting the kingdom first in our efforts to make disciples of Jesus. To say missiology gets the first priority is to say we decide what we do based upon what nourishes those that we're serving and trying to reach. In my view, this is consistent with the history of Anglicanism at its best. Further complicating my ability to reconcile the diversity of churchmanship within the Anglican Church, even C4SO, was the fact that an English friend and C4SO pastor Ben Chase told me a couple months ago on the phone that globally, Anglicanism tends toward low churchmanship. The Anglican Church of North America is the exception, he told me. And again, I was wondering why. Like, how did this happen? Bishop Todd was helpful here as well. He first emphasized he's not an expert, but generally speaking, he said that the majority world Anglicanism is low because of culture and economics. Let's start with culture. Anglicanism, he explained, was colonial. Were there negative aspects of colonialism? Yes. But in this case, what he's pointing out is that the Anglican Church in places, especially in places like Africa, it was brought from the outside in India, in New Zealand, in Australia. It was brought from England to those places, and those places obviously had their own culture. And so he said, their experience of churchmanship is different because there's always a give and take involved in those situations. Therefore, a lot of the churchmanship was dropped because of this new culture. But then there's economics. As Todd explained, vestments are and always have been very expensive. He explained to me that everything that I would need would be thousands of dollars. And even some of the cups, the chasubles, the gold chasuble, he said, Adam, in today's dollars, that's over $1,000. And so part of the reason that the majority world tends to be more low church in Anglicanism is economic reality. They're just generally less affluent. So where does this leave me? Well, I'm satisfied. I'm satisfied with the fact that now I understand that churchmanship at its best, high or low up the candle, high or low church, at its best, it's a reflection of missiology. We do it when it's what best nourishes our people. And thanks to Bishop Todd and some other research, I can see that at its best, that's what Anglicanism has always done. So where does this lead Narrate? See, I return to something I've heard Todd say several times indirectly, and thanks to our recent conversation, I've now heard it said directly to me, which means a lot. Adam, he said, so long as you can argue from a missional purpose, I'll always have your back. I love that. Actually, that afternoon I was walking Yachty. It was too rainy to go for a ride, and I was thinking about that conversation. It's one of those conversations that the value of it transcends the words that I can recall and the notes that I took. And I just texted Bishop Todd and I said, I have no doubt I'll be referencing that 30 minutes for the rest of my life. Because what it really captured was Bishop Todd's heart to say, we're first and foremost missiologists called to be ambassadors of the kingdom, and therefore to do what the local culture most needs and will most easily receive, or if not easily received, will receive in a way that's most natural to them as we try to share the gospel. Thanks. I hope that helps you in your own understanding of churchmanship.
If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org.
You can also look us up on Facebook or Instagram. Thanks for listening.